to, well, less cerebral subjects. And we're going to talk about secondary schools because many thousands of parents today across the country, and more specifically across this great city, are going to be receiving letters today. You maybe already got yours, telling you whether or not your child has got into the secondary school of their choice, indeed of your choice. We understand that up to 9 children are competing for every spare place in schools across the country. In London, it's even worse than that. The Mossbourne Academy, a school in East London turned around by Sir Michael Wilshaw, the new head of Ofsted, has reported an application ratio of 8 to 1. Some 1,587 children bidding for just 200 places. The free schools, particularly the free schools across West London, set up, you obviously remember from Toby Young, the man who helped set up the West London Free School in Hammersmith. 1,078 children have competed for just 120 places. The facts are, whatever school you've applied for, wherever you live, 1 in 6 children today will not get into their first choice school. 1 in 20 won't get into any of their top 3 choices. Where does that leave you if there's only one decent school in your area? Or indeed, if there are no decent schools in your area? I'd like to know how you fared today. If you got one of the letters, or you're awaiting the letter, you're not going to get the post. I don't know about you, my first post arrives about 2 p.m. If you haven't got the post yet, but you're sitting at work today, tenterhooks all day about whether or not your child has got into the school that will make a difference to the rest of their life, because that is the reality in terms of the sort of schools, places that are available, the ones that parents want and the ones that parents don't want. I want to know, what did you do in the past, if this has affected you before, and what would you do to get your child into the right school? How far would you go? Have you moved house? Have you taken out a super duper huge comedy mortgage, as I have, to move into a decent area of a decent state school? Have you done the old dodgy renting a flat in the catchment area of a good state secondary for a year so that you can claim a local residency to get your kid into the school? Have you entered a lottery for your local school? What did you do? And what would you do? How far would you go? Would you lie? I would. I'm going to be honest. I'd do whatever I had to do to get my kid into a good school. 0845 6060 973 is a number for you to call. And if you haven't got a kid right now looking at school places, if you've not even had this, you must nevertheless have an opinion on what sort of system we should have for allotting pupils to schools, or schools to pupils, depending on which way you want to look at it. How should we go about deciding which children go to which school? Because it used to be that it was the catchment area. If you lived locally, you went there. And then everyone said that was unfair because the sharp-elbowed middle classes kept moving to these areas, putting up house prices by 50,000, 100,000 plus, and that meant that local kids who didn't come from well-to-do families couldn't get into the school. Is it a lottery that's fairest? Is it catchment areas? Is it first come, first served? Tell me, what's the fairest way for us to decide which children should get into which school so that we don't end up having to send our kids to a sink school 6 miles away? 0845 6060 973. Tell me, what did you do? What would you do to get your child into the right school? Don't forget, you can also tweet at LBC973 and to me directly at JuliaHB1. Let's talk now to Katie Crace. She runs an educational consultancy firm, is a former teacher herself and author of the book, Get Your Child into the School You Want. Katie Crace, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and it's so wonderful to hear what you're saying, because I feel so passionately about this subject. And one of the things that you've hit on is, and I think the best advice you can have to any parent is, learn what the system is ahead of time. You refer to, is it right, and what's the best way, and should it be a lottery, and should it be this? That's all very interesting and very much for your listeners to debate. What I would say is, I'm very keen on just letting people know that the system is the way it is, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. This is the system, and it's so important to be ahead of time in order to play the system to your advantage. And from what you're saying, you've already done that because you've moved into an area to make sure that your child's got that opportunity.
Yeah, I have to say, I've got to be honest, I mean, and regular listeners will know when we did that, and we did think we'd done that, and it turns out actually, because we weren't believers, we didn't go to church, we weren't actually eligible for any of the schools we thought we could get into, and we've had to go private. And it genuinely, it was a really gut-wrenching decision to do. As it is, it's worked out wonderfully. But we are aware, incredibly lucky and incredibly privileged to be in a position where we can afford to do that. And most people aren't.
I think the buzzword is admissions criteria. And you need to be completely on board and on a yearly basis just double-check it doesn't change, because things do change from year to year. But it's the admissions criteria for the primary schools and indeed for the secondary schools that will allow you to know ahead of time, ahead of actually putting down your preferences, how likely your child will get in.
But the trouble is, what's written up though, Katie, and on a lot of schools' websites, and we'd only looked at the primary school stage, and the secondary school stage is much more competitive, is that they'll say we have a catchment area of 2 miles, but in reality you might be eligible, but in fact all the places are gone after about 250 yards. And the catchment area in reality is nothing like as big as the school will say. So even if you do check this out in advance, you discover, as we did, that actually you're not eligible.
You're quite right. They have their admissions criteria and they give priority in certain orders. So priority is always with, first of all, looked after children and children with a statement of educational needs. Then priority is usually with siblings, so if you've got a brother or a sister at the school. And then if it is oversubscribed, it will come down to catchment area. Now, how that works is it will be dependent from year to year. Depends how oversubscribed it is and how far that ring goes out. What you can do is ring up your local authority and give them your postcode and ask how far the school offered out in previous years. Now, that won't give you a guarantee, but it will give you a realistic idea of how likely your application will be successful for this particular year. And it's very important that you do that, because there are many people across London where English is a second language, where they haven't gone through the process themselves, they've not been schooled in the British system, and they just don't know. And when they filled in the forms, and for both primary and secondary now, we have to fill in what's called a CAF form, a common application form, and parents are asked to put in their preferred choices. And parents think that that's their guarantee to get a place, but it's not. If you don't meet the admissions criteria, you won't get a place. And there are some people whereby they will be putting down schools where their children have no chance of getting in, because they might be applying to a boys' school and it's actually they've got a daughter. It does happen.
That's it. As you say, you've got to know your stuff. The trouble is, I mean, even if you know your stuff, you can still, fall by the wayside, can't you? And there's something like 100,000 parents every year, and it's growing every single year, actually appealed against the decisions, and not many of them were successful last year. And we're expecting more and more appeals this year because, of course, not just because of demographic changes in terms of the number of children there are now of school age as a result of immigration and indeed higher birth rates, but also because of the recession. People who perhaps might have gone into the private system a few years ago are now back in the state system. And so there's added pressure this year more than ever.
You're absolutely right. At the agency that I run, Yarderberg Craze Educational Consultancy, we have found that there has been a rise in demand for tutoring, and that's because people are tutoring their children in year 5 and in year 6 so that they can go to a free school, go to a grammar school, a state selective school, so they save on the payment when they go to a good secondary school. They'd rather pay it now, get the tutoring, get the child in, rather than at a later stage. It's actually going to get more complicated because there's a new schools admissions code which has just been published. It's out on the 1st of February, and it was published by the DFE, and it changes the admissions criteria again.
Is that for next year or this year?
No, it affects the current Year 5 children. And what it means is that, there are quite a few changes, but the significant change is that previously you would fill in your CAS form and you'd put in your choices, and then your choices would be sent to the individual schools up to 6, and they would decide whether to offer your child a place or not. And for the state selective schools, they're the most competitive ones, then your child would sit an exam, and based on the exam, they would then find out whether they'd been successful, and then they would find out today whether they have been successful. They're changing that for next year. The exam has to take place before the parents fill in the form, or the deadline for filling in the form.
If the child perhaps doesn't do so well in the exam, they can be advised, look, you're not going to get in, don't waste one of your preferred places on this school.
Exactly.
Well, that seems to
100%.
make sense. The trouble is, Katie, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of parents who want the best for their child, regardless of where they live or how many children they've got, what their income is. I would say not all, 98, 99% of parents want to do the very best for their children. And yet they're forced to go through these terrible, these traumas. I mean, even in the private system, I had sleepless nights because if we hadn't got into one of the schools we'd applied for, we had no chance of getting into a state school that I would even dream of sending my child to.
There are lots of issues there.
But there are so many parents who are in this situation, who've worked hard, who've done well, who want the best for their kids, and then they find that all they've got is the local sink school. What can they do?
Well, the first thing I would say is the government says that they're meeting your requirement because all the boroughs are able to offer you a school. And that's them meeting their legal requirement. And they would say that every school is a good school. Now, from a parent point of view, and I've got 2 children myself, and I really know the difference between talking as a teacher and talking as a mum, there are some schools there is no way I would send my child to. So the advice that I give to parents are, do your homework beforehand. If you are limited, there are 3 choices: state selective, and private. Bottom line, you need the money to go private. And the advantage of private is smaller class sizes, but it won't necessarily be better teaching.
Yeah.
The other alternative is state, and if it's state selective, then that's great, but your child has to be in that top 5%. And I spend every weekend testing children for parents so that I can give parents realistic feedback on whether these schools are going to be right for their children, because we don't want children going to state-selected schools and then sink when they get there. So they have to be of the right academic level to begin with. Mm-hmm. If they're not going to be going down the state-selective route, then you are limited to state. And then it's a case of do your homework. And if you genuinely feel that you will not be offered a place at the school that you would like to send your child to, and you feel realistically because of logistics you will end up at, as you say, the sink school, you're going to have to move. I'm not saying the system's right, but I'm saying that is the system.
As that. Katie Cray, she runs an educational consultancy firm. She's a former teacher and author of the book Get Your Child into the School You Want. She can see it from all sides. I think, as you've heard in our conversation just now, Katie Cray, thank you so much for joining us here at LBC 97.3. So if you're one of those parents, maybe you're doing this today, maybe you're getting the letter today, maybe you're facing all this in the next few years, maybe you've dealt with it in the last few years. What did you do? What would you do to get your child into the right school? I'd love to know how you fared today, how far you're willing to go to get your kid into the right school. I'd do anything. 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. The time now is just coming up to 1:17.